They said she wasn't worth $1. He gave a bent spoon and a joke. Years later, he wept like a child when she whispered, "I do." This is his story. Please subscribe and click the like button so this story can reach more folks out there who believe in second chances and unexpected love. Silas Wren lived on a ranch in Wyoming. 1887. He was 42 years old, or so he figured. Days just piled up, one after the other, and the numbers didn't much matter after a while. 8 years back, his wife, Mary, died bringing their first baby into the world. The baby went with her. He'd buried them both out on the low hill behind the house, where the wind came off the plains strongest. He hadn't remarried. He hadn't even thought about it. The idea just felt wrong, like trying to fix a fence post that was already rotted through to the core. He didn't talk much. Sometimes when he went into town for supplies, the storekeeper would ask how the winter had treated the cattle, and Silas would grunt something about it being fine, or not. That was usually the extent of it. Folks in Harmony Creek knew him as the quiet one, or, sometimes, the ghost on horseback. They didn't mean it unkindly, not usually, it was just a fact. Like the way the creek always froze in November. He rode his horse, an old dun mare named Grey, with a straight back and eyes that saw everything but gave nothing away. His only real companion was Barrel, a hound dog so old his muzzle was white, and his bark was just a wheeze. Barrel followed him from the barn to the house, from the house to the well, a shadow that never asked questions. Life was a routine, up before dawn, even in the dead of winter, coffee so black it looked like crude oil, out to the barn to feed the horses and the handful of cattle he still kept. Check the fences, always checking the fences, even when he knew they were sound. The wind was a constant, a low hum against the eaves of the house, a whistling through the cracks in the walls. It got into everything, into his clothes, into his bones, into the silence of the ranch. He ate alone at the dinner table, the same scratched wooden surface Mary had polished with a cloth dipped in beeswax. Her chair was still there, tucked in. He didn't touch it. It was just a chair. He'd watch the candle flicker, casting long, dancing shadows, and the only sound would be the occasional snap of the fire in the hearth, or the sigh of Barrel dreaming by his feet. Sometimes, he'd pick up a book, but the words just floated off the page, meaningless. There wasn't anything left to feel. Not really. Not anymore. Just the going through the motions until the sun went down, and then again when it came up. He didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad one. A few weeks later, a battered caravan rumbled into the outskirts of Harmony Creek. It was a traveling circus, or what passed for one in those parts. Dust followed it like a mournful cloud. The wagons were painted in faded, peeling colors, reds and blues that had seen too many suns. They set up their sorry tents in a field just past the last general store, smelling of stale hay and something wild and unwashed. People drifted out from town, a mix of curious children and skeptical adults. They sold oddities, the barker shouted, things you wouldn't believe, and animals, and people. Among the collection, set apart from a mangy bear and a handful of sad-looking chickens, was a girl. She was young, maybe 20, though it was hard to tell. Her face was smudged, and her hair, a dark tangle, looked like it hadn't seen a comb in years. She wore a dress made of patched-up canvas that hung on her like a sack. Her feet were bare, calloused and cracked from walking. She stood still, head tilted slightly, watching the sparse crowd with eyes that seemed too wide, too old for her face. There was a small sign nailed to the post beside her, scrawled in charcoal. The cursed one. The barker, a man with a booming voice and a stained waistcoat, would point to her. They say her stare brings bad luck, he'd bellow, gesturing wildly. Anything that goes wrong, it's her fault. A storm? The cursed one. A failed crop? The cursed one. People in the crowd would murmur. Some spat, a quick, almost unconscious gesture of disgust. Others laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound, and edged away. No one dared to touch her, not even the children who pressed close to see the bear. She just stood there, taking it all in, not flinching, not reacting. Her gaze was steady, though it seemed to look through everything, past the crowd, past the dusty field, to something else entirely. It was like she wasn't quite there, but a part of her was. Silas watched from the edge of the crowd, leaning against the rough wood of his saddle. Barrel at his feet. He didn't move, he didn't say a word. His eyes, usually unreadable, seemed to narrow just a fraction as he took in the scene. He saw the way the wind lifted a strand of her hair, the way her shoulders hunched ever so slightly, the dark circles under her eyes. He saw the fear in the faces of the townsfolk, but he saw something else too, something in the way she held herself, a stillness that wasn't quite defeat. He knew about stillness. The thought came unbidden, just a flicker in his mind. He didn't step forward, not yet. He just watched. The sun was going down, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and orange, and the light caught the girl's face, making her look like a ghost herself, standing there among the fading colors. He wondered what she saw when she looked out at all of them. The next morning, the circus was packing up. The show hadn't been much of a success, and the wagons looked even more dejected in the harsh light of day. Tent poles were coming down, and the mangy bear was being prodded back into its small cage. The barker was trying to offload the last of his wares, his voice rough from shouting. The girl, the cursed one, was still there, standing by her post, unsold. No one had come close, not even the drunks who usually haunted the edges of town. The owner, a scrawny man with a long, thin mustache and tired eyes, scowled at her. "Waste of good feed," he muttered, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. He looked around, his gaze landing on Silas, who was still standing by his horse, watching. Silas had stayed, almost without thinking about it. He just felt stuck, like a wagon wheel in the mud. The owner's sneer deepened. "All right, folks, last chance," he hollered, his voice lacking its usual vigor. "This one here, she's a real burden. Can't even sweep a tent right. Tell you what," he waved a dismissive hand at the girl. "Give me anything. I'll trade her for a bent spoon and a laugh. Just want her gone." A few people chuckled nervously. It was a joke, of course. Who would actually buy a person for a bent spoon? Silas, without a word, pushed off the saddle he'd been leaning on. He walked slow, deliberate steps across the dusty ground. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pewter spoon. It was old, tarnished, and yes, bent at the handle, just a little. He held it out to the owner. The owner's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise there. Silas's face was, as always, unreadable. He looked at the owner, then at the girl, then back at the owner. "I reckon your act," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, "is the real curse." A few hearty laughs erupted from the small crowd. They were surprised, some of them, and a little shocked. But the humor was clear enough. The owner stared at the spoon, then at Silas's face. He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, a dry sound. He shrugged. "Deal done, mister," he said, snatching the spoon. He untied the rope that held the girl to the post. She stood there, still and silent, not even blinking. Silas turned to her. He reached out, his hand large and calloused, and took her by the wrist. He didn't say anything, just a firm, gentle grip. He led her away from the fading circus, towards his horse. No one clapped, no one cheered. A few people watched, their expressions unreadable, as Silas helped the girl onto the back of Grey, then mounted behind her. She didn't look back at the circus. She didn't look back at the town. She just stared straight ahead, a small, still figure against the vast, empty plains. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass, and they rode out, leaving the dust and the whispers behind. It was over, just like that. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The only sounds were the soft thud of Grey's hooves on the dry ground, and the steady whistle of the wind. Silas didn't try to make conversation. He didn't ask her name, or where she came from, or what she'd seen. He figured she'd talk if she wanted to. She didn't. She just sat in front of him, stiff and small, her back rigid. He could feel the slight tremor in her shoulders, a constant vibration that told him she was coiled tight, ready for anything, or nothing. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to prickle the inky sky. Thousands of them, cold and distant. After an hour or so, when the last of the light had faded, and the air turned sharp with the coming night, Silas pulled a piece of jerky from his saddlebag. It was tough, cured beef, good for long rides. He held it out to her. She flinched, just a little, a small intake of breath. Her eyes darted to his hand, then to his face, then back to the jerky. She didn't take it. She just stared at it, as if it might bite her. He kept his hand steady. She winced, almost imperceptibly, and then, very slowly, her fingers brushed his, hesitant. She took the jerky, but she didn't eat it right away. She held it clutched in her hand, like a small, precious stone, her knuckles white. He didn't push her. She kept glancing at the rifle in its scabbard next to his leg, a quick, furtive movement of her eyes. He didn't notice. He was used to the rifle being there, part of the landscape. She probably just saw a weapon, another thing that could hurt her. The thought floated through his mind, a detached observation. The cold deepened, seeping into his clothes. He thought about Mary, how she used to complain about the wind. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat. Without a word, he draped it around June's shoulders. It was far too big for her, swallowing her whole, the wool rough against her cheek. She stiffened, but only for a moment. Then, slowly, she pulled the coat tighter around herself, burying her face slightly in the collar. She still didn't say anything. They rode on, the hours blurring into a long stretch of darkness and quiet. The moon rose, a pale sliver, casting long shadows of themselves on the ground. Silas could feel the rhythm of her breathing, shallow and quick for a long time. Then, very gradually, a little slower, a little deeper, he thought, briefly, about what he was doing, bringing a stranger, a woman, back to his empty house. He didn't have an answer. It just seemed like the right thing to do, or maybe the only thing to do. The first faint blush of pre-dawn light was just appearing on the eastern horizon, when the ranch house finally came into view, a dark silhouette against the paling sky. Barrel, hearing the familiar hoofbeats, let out a soft bark from the porch. They had made it. The ride had changed everything, even if nothing felt different yet. Silas dismounted first, his legs stiff from the long ride. He reached up, helped June slide down from Gray's back. She stumbled a little, her legs unsteady, but caught herself quickly. Barrel came trotting up, sniffed at her bare feet, then her ragged clothes. He wagged his tail once. A slow, questioning wag. Silas just nodded to the dog. He led June to the front door of the house. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning softly. The air inside was cool, smelling faintly of dust and old wood smoke. He walked her down the short hall, past the kitchen, to the room that had been Mary's. It was small, a single window looking out over the low hills. The bed was neatly made, a faded quilt spread over it. He hadn't used the room since Mary died, not even for storage. It was just there. He gestured to the room, then stepped back, letting her enter first. She walked in slowly, her head turning, her eyes taking in every detail, the small chest of drawers, the single wooden chair, the unlit lamp on the bedside table. She didn't say anything. Silas went to the kitchen. He poked the embers in the stove, added some kindling, and soon a small fire was crackling. He poured water into a pot to heat, then ladled some leftover stew into a bowl. He carried the bowl back to her door. He didn't go in. He stood outside, knuckles resting against the doorframe. "There's food on the stove," he said, his voice rough. "Help yourself." He waited for a response. There was none. He heard the faint scrape of movement inside, then silence. He turned and went back to the kitchen, leaving the bowl there. Later, an hour or so later, he went back. The bowl was gone. He looked inside the room. It was on the small bedside table, scrubbed clean. She had eaten. That was something. The next day, he brought a large tin tub into the kitchen, the one Mary used for laundry. He filled it with buckets of hot water from the stove, then added a little lye soap. He found a stack of Mary's old clothes, still folded in a cedar chest, smelling faintly of lavender, a simple cotton dress, a clean shift. He placed them on the small wooden chair inside her room. He knocked on the door, then stepped away, giving her space. He heard her stir, but nothing else. He went about his chores, feeding Barrel, mending a bridle. When he came back inside later, the tub was empty, water drained, the old clothes were gone, and the new ones were gone too. He found her sitting by the hearth in the main room, wrapped in one of Mary's plain grey dresses. It was still too big, but it wasn't the ragged canvas. Her dark hair was damp, slightly tidier, no longer a tangled mess. She sat perfectly still, her eyes darting from the fire to the window, to the door, always scanning, still silent. He let her be. That night, Silas slept with his door unlatched. It was a small thing, but it felt like a large one. A full week passed, marked by the constant Wyoming wind that always seemed to find a way under the eaves. June still hadn't said a single word. Not yes, not no, not a thank you. Silas didn't push her. He learned to read her small movements, the way her eyes followed him. He went about his routines, the same as always. Up before the sun, out to the barn. He'd chop wood, the axe ringing sharp against the cold air. He'd feed the horses, shovel out the stalls. He'd check the fences, riding the perimeter of his land, the wire humming in the wind. She watched him. He'd catch her sometimes, standing just inside the barn door, or by the kitchen window, her gaze fixed on him. Not a stare, not really, more like observation. She was absorbing, learning the patterns of his life. After a few days, She started to mimic him. Silently. He'd be splitting logs, and she'd pick up a smaller piece. Try to split it herself. Her movements hesitant, then more confident. She learned to feed Barrel without him telling her. Putting a small pile of scraps by the dog's bowl, she'd bring water from the well, 2 buckets at a time. Her arms surprisingly strong. She would wipe down the kitchen table after they ate. Her motions slow and deliberate. She was a silent partner, a shadow, yet a presence. It was odd, this unspoken understanding. One evening, Silas was sitting by the fire, oiling his boots. The house was quiet, except for the crackle of the flames. Then he heard it, so faint he almost thought the wind had brought it. A humming sound, barely audible, a low, tuneless melody. It stopped as soon as he shifted, as if she knew he'd heard. He didn't look up, just kept oiling his boots, letting the sound, or the memory of it, hang in the air. He didn't know what the song was, or if it was even a song. It was just a sound she made. That same night, when he sat down for supper, his plate was waiting for him on the table, just as he had left it. But beside it, carefully folded, was a cloth napkin. It was one of Mary's, a plain white linen, and it had been washed clean. He picked it up. It was still slightly damp. He unfolded it, then refolded it. He placed it back down. He looked at June, sitting across from him. Her eyes were on her own plate, but he thought he saw the barest hint of a flush on her cheeks. It was the first sign she was staying, a deliberate action that meant more than any words. He felt something shift inside him, a quiet recognition, but he couldn't put a name to it. He just ate his supper. They were sitting by the fire one evening, the wind rattling the window panes. When it happened, Silas was whittling a piece of wood, shaping it into something he hadn't quite decided on yet. June was patching a tear in one of her old dresses, her head bent. The silence was comfortable now, no longer heavy. She looked up. Her needle paused mid-stitch. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, they held. "June," she said. The word was soft, a whisper against the sounds of the fire and the wind. It was just one word. His name, or at least, the name she was now claiming. Silas stopped whittling. He looked at her. He didn't say anything, didn't ask her to repeat it, didn't show any surprise. He just nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement of his head. It was enough. The name hung in the air between them, a fragile, new thing. A few days later, she spoke again. More than a single word this time. They were out by the barn, Silas tightening a loose board, June gathering eggs from the hens. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming. She paused, an egg cupped in her hand, and looked at him. Her voice was still quiet, but clearer this time. "You don't believe I'm cursed?" she asked. There was a faint tremor in her voice, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place, but recognized as old fear. Silas straightened up, dropping his hammer. He looked at the darkening sky, then back at her. The wind whipped her hair across her face. He thought about Mary, and the baby, and the empty years. He thought about the storms he'd ridden out alone, the ones that had raged inside him, quiet and fierce. "Storms don't scare me anymore," he said. His voice was low, rough, but steady. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. He just looked at her, his eyes steady. Her gaze held his. She didn't smile, not exactly, but something in her eyes softened. The tremor left her voice. It was a connection, a small, tentative bridge built between them, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with quiet words and shared understanding. He went back to the loose board. The first fat drops of rain began to fall. She just watched him, the egg still in her hand. The rain hit the dry dust of the yard, making small, dark spots. He picked up his hammer again. The silence was different now. It had a new weight to it, something lighter, something that might grow. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, marked by June's quiet presence and her newfound, if still infrequent, words. But Harmony Creek was a small town, and news traveled like a spark on dry grass. Silas had brought a woman back to his ranch, a woman from a traveling circus, no less. Whispers started. Most folks figured he'd bought himself a woman, either for a maid or something else entirely. They used phrases like bought goods and a bargain for a lonely man. Silas needed supplies one afternoon, and June, after a moment's hesitation, followed him into town. She still wore the plain dress, but her hair was now neatly braided. She walked a few paces behind him, her head slightly bowed, but her eyes taking everything in. When they stepped into O'Malley's general store, the usual quiet was replaced by a sudden, unnatural hush. Old Man O'Malley, a barrel-chested man with a grimy apron, looked from Silas to June, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, well, Silas," O'Malley boomed, his voice too loud in the small space. He winked, a slow, lecherous movement. "Heard you finally got yourself some company out there. Must be nice to have a woman to warm your bed after all these years. And for a bent spoon, too. Heard she works cheap." He let out a hearty, braying laugh. June's shoulders hunched, her eyes dropped to the scuffed floorboards, and a faint flush rose on her neck. She stood perfectly still, like a deer caught in a hunter's sights, shrinking into herself. Silas's face, which rarely showed emotion, became utterly still, his eyes, usually distant, sharpened, focusing directly on O'Malley. He didn't say a word, he just walked up to the counter, his steps slow and deliberate. O'Malley's laugh died in his throat. Silas reached over the counter, his hand a blur. There was a sudden, sickening crunch, a sharp gasp from O'Malley, and then the sound of something wet hitting the floor. O'Malley stumbled back, clutching his face, blood gushing from his nose. It was broken, clearly broken. Silas stood there, his hand resting on the counter, perfectly still. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The store was utterly silent now, except for O'Malley's whimpers. Silas just turned, his gaze sweeping over the handful of other customers, chilling them to the bone. He didn't even look at June. He simply walked out, and June followed, her steps still quiet, but perhaps a touch quicker. He didn't explain himself. He never did. The town learned that day. They learned that Silas Wren was quiet. Yes, but that silence now carried a sharp edge. They learned not to talk about June. Not ever. Not again. A few days after the incident in town, a quiet stillness settled over the ranch once more. Silas was doing some cleaning, moving things around in the small, rarely used storage room off the main hall. It was dusty, filled with old boxes and forgotten bits of furniture. He pulled open a large camphor-scented chest, one that hadn't been opened since before Mary died. Inside, neatly folded and smelling faintly of dried flowers, were some of her dresses. He pulled one out. It was a simple, pale blue calico, worn soft from years of use, but still beautiful in its own way. It was untouched, uncreased, just as she had left it. He looked at it for a long moment, the fabric cool against his fingers. He closed the chest. Later that afternoon, while June was out by the chicken coop, he walked into her room. He didn't hesitate. He simply laid the dress out on her bed, smoothed down the fabric, and walked out. He left no note. He didn't mention it. He just left it there, an unspoken offering. The next Sunday, June wore it. He was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking his morning coffee, the bitter warmth of familiar comfort in his hands. He heard the rustle of fabric, and then she walked into the main room, heading towards the small, tarnished mirror that hung on the wall. She was wearing the blue dress. It fit her better than Mary's old grey one, hugging her slender frame, the pale blue a soft contrast to her dark hair. She moved with a lightness he hadn't seen before, a quiet grace. She stopped in front of the mirror. She raised a hand, tracing the outline of her reflection. She didn't preen, didn't pose. She just looked, and then, slowly, a small smile touched her lips. It wasn't a wide, joyful grin. Not yet. It was soft, hesitant, a quiet blossoming that crinkled the corners of her eyes. It was a smile meant only for herself, for the stranger in the mirror, who was beginning to look back at her with something other than fear or emptiness. Silas watched her from the kitchen, hidden from her view. He didn't move. He felt a quiet jolt, a sudden, almost uncomfortable warmth spread through his chest. He saw her then, not as the broken, silent girl from the circus, but as something more, someone who could wear a soft blue dress and find a quiet moment of peace in her own reflection. He just watched, sipping his coffee, the bitter taste suddenly less important. A terrible thunderstorm hit the ranch 2 nights later. It rolled in fast, a dark, bruised mass on the horizon, moving with a speed that felt unnatural. Lightning began to crackle almost immediately, sharp, jagged white lines tearing across the sky. The thunder followed instantly, a deafening boom that shook the very foundations of the house. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the shutters, threatening to rip the roof off. Rain began to fall in sheets, hitting the ground with a force that sounded like 1,000 drums. A particularly close lightning strike, a brilliant flash that lit up the entire yard, hit an old oak tree near the barn. The tree split with a horrifying crack, half of it crashing to the ground. Silas had been checking the barn, making sure the animals were safe and calm. The mare, usually so wild, was agitated, whinnying nervously. He was trying to soothe her when he heard a sound from the back of the barn, a choked sob. He walked towards it, past the nervous horses, past the flapping canvas of the open hayloft door. He found June crouched in a corner, huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She was shaking violently, a low guttural sound escaping her throat. Her eyes were wide, vacant, staring at nothing. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw, barely audible over the storm. Please don't chain me again." Another lightning flash lit the barn, and she flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall, her sobs racking her small frame. She was back there, wherever there was, caught in a nightmare. Silas didn't hesitate. He knelt beside her, slowly, so as not to startle her. He didn't speak. He just extended a hand, large and calloused, and placed it gently on her shoulder. He didn't squeeze, didn't pat, just a quiet, steady presence. Her body stiffened under his touch. Then, slowly, gradually, she sagged. Her head, still buried in her knees, leaned into his hand, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The sobs didn't stop immediately, but they softened, became less frantic. She didn't say anything else that night. She just stayed there, leaning against him, while the storm raged outside. And then, slowly, quieted. After that night, a shift occurred between them. It was a subtle thing, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but profound for them. She stopped flinching when he walked by. If he reached for something near her, she wouldn't instinctively pull away. Sometimes, her hand would brush his in the kitchen, and she wouldn't recoil. The physical distance between them, unspoken and wide before, had begun to narrow. One quiet, gentle touch at a time. Silas had been trying to break a wild mare for a week, a young mustang with a fire in her eyes and a stubborn streak a mile wide. She was a beautiful animal, all muscle and spirit, but she bucked and reared every time he got near, her eyes rolling white with fear and fury. He'd tried everything he knew, every trick he'd learned from his father, but nothing worked. She just wouldn't be tamed. He'd come back to the house each evening, dusty and frustrated, the smell of horse sweat heavy on his clothes. He thought about just letting her go, but she was too good a horse for that. One afternoon, after another failed attempt that ended with him eating dirt, he sat on a bale of hay, watching the mare pace nervously in the corral. June had been observing him, as she often did, from the edges of the barn. She walked over, her steps quiet on the packed earth. She stood for a moment, then, hesitantly, she spoke. "May I try?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She nodded towards the mare. Silas looked at her. He hesitated. It was dangerous work. She knew nothing about horses, not really, but he'd seen her quiet patience, the way she handled the chickens, even Barrel. He shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice flat. He didn't expect anything. June walked into the corral, slow and deliberate. The mare immediately stopped pacing, her head up, ears swiveling, eyes fixed on June. June didn't approach directly. She walked in a wide circle, not looking at the mare directly, but keeping her in her peripheral vision. She hummed, a soft, tuneless melody, the same one he'd heard that night by the fire. Then, very slowly, she began to sing. It was a lullaby. He recognized it vaguely, an old song his mother used to hum. It was simple, gentle, repetitive. She continued to circle, the song a soft murmur, and then, without him quite seeing how, she was closer. The mare, incredibly, lowered her head. She nickered softly, a questioning sound. June reached out a hand, still humming, and slowly, gently, stroked the mare's nose. The mare didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch. June continued to murmur to her, and the mare stood still, quiet, almost calm. Silas watched, stunned. He stood up, forgetting the dirt on his clothes. He had never seen anything like it. The wild, untamed animal was quieted, not by force, but by a whisper and a song. He stood there for a long moment, then cleared his throat. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. June turned, her face a little flushed from the effort. She looked at the mare, stroking her neck. "My mother," she said softly, her voice distant, as if she were speaking of another life. "She sang it to me, before they sold me." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. The words hung in the air between them, a heavy weight. He understood then, a shared grief, a quiet, unspoken admiration for the gentle power she possessed. He just nodded. The mare nudged June's hand, a soft, trusting gesture. Winter came early that year, a fierce, biting blizzard that locked them in for a full week. Snow piled against the windows, drifts so high they buried the fence posts. The wind howled ceaselessly, a mournful sound that became the soundtrack to their days. The temperature dropped so low the water in the bucket froze solid in the kitchen if they weren't careful. It was just the two of them, and Beryl. In the small, warm haven of the ranch house, they cooked together. June, still quiet, had learned the rhythms of the kitchen, the way Silas liked his coffee, the simple meals they ate. She made a stew one night, thick with carrots and potatoes, that tasted like comfort. He found himself actually talking to her about the weather, about the cattle, about the state of the fences. Not much, but enough. He'd point out stars when the clouds broke, a brief, clear patch of sky. He even started teaching her to read. He'd pull out one of the few books he owned, an old Bible, and point to the words, sounding them out slowly. She was a quick study, her brow furrowed in concentration, her finger tracing the lines. She'd mend his torn shirts, her stitches neat and small. He'd sit across from her, sharpening his knife, listening to the soft rustle of the pages, the hum of her quiet focus. One night, the blizzard still raging outside, they sat by the fire, mugs of steaming coffee warming their hands. Beryl was asleep at Silas's feet, snoring softly. June was looking into the flames, her face illuminated by the flickering light. Her voice was very soft, barely above a whisper. "I used to dream about dying," she said, her eyes still on the fire. "Every night. I just wanted it to be over. I don't anymore." Silas froze. The mug was halfway to his lips. He felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, something that had been buried so deep he thought it was gone. He looked at her, truly looked. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion still etched around her eyes, but also something else, a quiet strength, a fragile hope. He felt his own eyes prickle, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 8 years. He almost cried. He swallowed hard. He didn't cry. He just poured her more coffee, his hand steady, then his own. He stirred the fire, pushing the logs deeper into the embers, watching the sparks fly up the chimney. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't know what to say. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, warm, and somehow hopeful. The snow had melted, and the spring thaw was turning the ranch yard into a muddy mess. Life had returned to its routines, but a quiet companionship had settled into the rhythms of the house. One afternoon, Silas rode into Harmony Creek to pick up a few things, and when he returned, there was a letter waiting for him in his mailbox. It wasn't a common occurrence. Most communication was face-to-face. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy, and the handwriting was stiff and formal. His jaw tightened when he saw the return address. Richmond, Virginia. His late wife, Mary, had a brother there, a man named Thomas. He took the letter inside, the mud tracking in on his boots. He sat at the kitchen table, the letter unopened in his hand. June was kneading dough for bread, her hands dusted with flour, her movements rhythmic and practiced. She glanced at him, then at the letter. She didn't ask. He just stared at the envelope, a tension building in his shoulders. He didn't want to open it. He knew what it would say, or at least what kind of words it would contain. Thomas had always blamed Silas for Mary's death, for the death of their baby. He'd sent a letter right after the funeral, full of accusations, words that had cut deep. June, seeing the grim set of his mouth, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the envelope, slowly wiped her hands on her apron. She walked over to the table. She reached out, her fingers hesitant, and gently took the letter from his hand. He didn't resist. She looked at the address, then back at him. She didn't open it. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. Silas took a deep breath. He ran a hand over his face. He hadn't spoken about Mary, or the baby, to anyone. Not really. Not in years. But June had a way of listening that made words feel less heavy. "It's Mary's brother," he said, his voice low and raspy. "He blames me for her, for them." He paused, looking away, out the window at the muddy yard. "He says he's coming, to take whatever dignity Silas has left." The words were bitter on his tongue. He knew what Thomas thought, that he was a broken man, incapable of anything. June put the letter down on the table. She reached out, her hand still faintly dusted with flour, covering his. It was a simple, quiet gesture. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her touch was a question and an answer, all at once. He looked at her hand on his, then back at the window. "I buried them both in the same grave," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I still visit every Sunday, right there, on the hill behind the house. He lifted his hand, palm up, and she squeezed it gently. The silence was not empty, but full of understanding. 3 days later, Thomas arrived. He drove up in a rented buggy, the wheels sinking into the still soft mud of the ranch road. He was a tall man, broader than Silas, with a red face and a swaggering gait. He was clearly drunk, even at midday, the smell of cheap whiskey preceding him. He strode to the house, his eyes narrowed, fixed on Silas, who had stepped out onto the porch. "Silas Wren," Thomas slurred, his voice thick with accusation. "Thought you'd be living in a hovel. Heard you bought yourself a harlot with a spoon." June stepped out from behind Silas, a movement so swift and protective it took Silas by surprise. She stood between them, her chin lifted, her eyes narrowed. She wasn't large, but her presence was fierce. Thomas stopped short, his eyes flicking to June, then back to Silas. He sneered. "Well, look what we have here." The silent one found himself astray. "Bargain trash. Are we? What did he pay for you, girl? A bent nail and a broken promise?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. June flinched, just a little, the old instinct to recoil. But she didn't move. She held her ground. Silas had been standing still, absorbing the insults directed at himself. But the words aimed at June, the crude mockery, hit him with a cold, clear rage. A shift happened in him, a tightening in his jaw, a hardening in his eyes that made him look like a different man. He took a single, deliberate step forward, putting himself fully in front of June. His voice was low, so low it was almost a growl, stripped of all emotion except a lethal calm. "You don't speak to her," he said. Each word was distinct, precise. "Ever," Thomas faltered. The drunken bluster seemed to deflate slightly in the face of Silas's unexpected intensity. He stared at Silas's face, at the unyielding force in his eyes. Silas didn't raise a hand. He didn't threaten. He just stood there, a wall of quiet fury, radiating a clear, unyielding command. "Get off my land," Silas said. His voice was no louder, but it resonated with a power that left no room for argument. Now, Thomas, for all his bluster, seemed to recognize the shift. He took a hesitant step back, then another. He mumbled something unintelligible, turned, and stumbled back to his buggy. He climbed in, fumbled with the reins, and drove off, leaving deep ruts in the mud. Silas watched him go, until the buggy was just a speck on the horizon. He didn't say another word. He just turned. Then, June was still standing behind him, her eyes wide. He looked at her, then into the house. The quiet protectiveness that had grown between them was now an unshakable thing. Spring turned to summer, and Silas started building. He wasn't a carpenter by trade, but he was handy enough. He started laying a new foundation just off the main room of the ranch house. Near the kitchen, the sounds of hammering and sawing became a regular part of the ranch's daily rhythm. He spent his mornings measuring and cutting, his afternoons hoisting beams into place. June would bring him water, watch him work, sometimes hand him a tool without being asked. She never asked him what he was building. Not at first. The room began to take shape. It was going to be a decent size, with its own window looking out to the east, catching the morning light. After a few weeks, when the walls were up and the roof was on, June walked over one afternoon while he was nailing a window frame into place. She watched him for a long moment, the steady rhythm of his hammer striking the nail. "Why are you building a new room?" she asked, her voice quiet. It wasn't a demand for an answer, more a simple curiosity. Silas paused, his hammer still. He turned to her, his face smudged with sawdust, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. He looked out at the rolling hills, then back at her. This wasn't a question he had rehearsed, not in his mind. He rarely thought about such things directly. He just knew it needed to be built.